The leaves had already begun to turn. Red and gold carpeted the streets of Cedar Falls like a promise of change, though Richard Calloway had no time for promises. He drove his black Mercedes through the small town with the windows up and the air conditioning on, even though the October air outside was crisp and clean. He did not want to smell the place. He did not want to know it. He only wanted to close the deal, collect his commission, and return to Chicago before sunset. Richard was 47 years old, with hair the color of brushed steel and eyes that had stopped seeing people a long time ago. He saw opportunities instead. He saw leverage. He saw the weaknesses in others and knew exactly how to exploit them. This had made him wealthy. It had also made him alone, though he would never admit that to anyone, least of all himself. The deal in Cedar Falls was simple. A local hardware store, family-owned for 3 generations, sat on a prime piece of real estate. The owner, a 63-year-old man named Harold Brennan, had refused to sell for years. But Harold was sick now, and his medical bills were mounting. Richard had done his research. He knew the exact amount of debt Harold carried. He knew the name of every creditor. He knew that Harold's wife had passed 2 years ago and that his only son had moved to Seattle and rarely called. Richard knew everything except the one thing that mattered most. He pulled into the parking lot of a diner called Mabel's Kitchen, a weathered establishment with a hand-painted sign and a row of motorcycles parked out front. Richard frowned at the bikes. Harleys, mostly. Chrome gleaming in the morning sun. Leather saddlebags worn by miles in weather. He counted 12 of them, lined up like soldiers at attention. Richard had no interest in motorcycles or the people who rode them. He had seen enough documentaries to form his opinions. Outlaws. Dropouts. Men who had failed at life and now pretended that their failure was a choice. He stepped out of his Mercedes, adjusted his tie, and walked toward the diner with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. Inside, Mabel's Kitchen was warm with the smell of bacon and fresh coffee. Red vinyl booths lined the walls, and a long counter stretched across the back, where a woman in her 50s poured coffee with practiced ease. The place was half full with locals, farmers in work boots, a young mother with 2 children, and occupying the largest booth in the corner, the bikers. There were 7 of them at the table, with more scattered at the counter. They wore leather vests over flannel shirts, and their arms were marked with tattoos that told stories Richard would never understand. Some had gray in their beards. Others were younger, with the lean hunger of men still searching for their place in the world. But all of them shared the same quiet presence, the same watchful eyes that noticed everything without appearing to look. Richard walked past them without a glance and slid into a booth near the window. He pulled out his phone and began reviewing the documents he would present to Harold Brennan. The offer was low, insultingly low, but Richard knew that desperation had a way of making people accept the unacceptable. He smiled at the thought. The waitress approached. Her name tag said Donna, and her face said she had seen every kind of customer walk through those doors. "What can I get you, hun?" Richard did not look up from his phone. "Coffee, black, and make sure it's hot." Donna's pen paused over her notepad. "It's always hot, sugar. This ain't my first day." She walked away before Richard could respond, and he felt a flicker of annoyance. Small-town people. No sense of professionalism. No understanding of how the real world worked. His coffee arrived in a white ceramic mug, and Richard took a sip without acknowledging Donna. It was good, better than he expected, but he would never say so. Compliments were currency, and he did not spend currency on people who could not help him. At the corner booth, the bikers were talking in low voices. Occasionally, one of them would laugh, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to fill the room. Richard glanced at them and felt a familiar contempt rise in his chest. Grown men playing dress-up, pretending their motorcycles and their leather made them something special. They were nothing. They were the kind of people Richard had spent his whole life stepping over. One of the bikers, a man with silver hair and a weathered face, met Richard's gaze. The man did not look away. He did not smile or frown. He simply held the eye contact with the patience of someone who had learned that silence often said more than words. Richard looked away first. He told himself it was because he had work to do, not because something in that steady gaze had unsettled him. An hour later, Richard finished his coffee and left a $10 bill on the table. No tip. Tips were for people who exceeded expectations, and Donna had merely done her job. He gathered his briefcase and walked toward the door, passing the biker's table on his way. One of the younger men had risen to put on his jacket, and the movement brought him directly into Richard's path. For a moment, the two men stood face to face. The biker was tall, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they had built things, fixed things, created something real in this world. "Excuse me," Richard said, though his tone made clear he was not asking. The young biker stepped aside with a polite nod. "No problem, sir." But Richard was not finished. Some dark impulse, some need to assert his superiority, made him pause and look back at the table of bikers. "Nice Halloween costumes," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What are you supposed to be, a motorcycle gang from a bad movie?" The diner went quiet. Donna stopped pouring coffee. The young mother gathered her children closer. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hold its breath. The silver-haired biker set down his mug. He did not rise. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Richard with those patient, knowing eyes and said, "We are just people having breakfast, friend. Same as you." Richard snorted. "People. Right. People with nothing better to do than play pretend on their little bikes." He walked out before anyone could respond, climbed into his Mercedes, and drove away with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had won something. But Richard Calloway did not know that the silver-haired biker's name was Samuel Vance. He did not know that Samuel had served 3 tours in the Middle East and had the medals to prove it. He did not know that every man and woman in that booth was part of a group called the Iron Guardians, a motorcycle club that had spent the last 20 years protecting children in foster care, escorting veterans to funerals, and standing watch outside homes where families feared for their safety. Richard did not know any of this. He only knew his own reflection, polished and empty, staring back at him from the rearview mirror. And he did not know that in 3 days his entire world would fall apart. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. These stories find the heroes hiding in plain sight, the ones the world overlooks, and they remind us that courage still rides among us. Subscribe now, because every story we tell might change the way you see the stranger sitting next to you. The Brennan hardware store stood on the corner of Main Street and 3rd Avenue, a brick building with a green awning that had faded over the decades from emerald to sage. The windows displayed tools arranged with care, hammers and wrenches and boxes of nails, the kind of honest merchandise that had built this town and 100 towns like it. Harold Brennan was behind the counter when Richard walked in. He was a thin man now, thinner than he had been before the illness started eating away at him, but his eyes were still sharp. They had to be. He had been running this store since he was 25 years old, learning the trade from his father, just as his father had learned from his. 3 generations of Brennans had served this community, and Harold had always believed his son would continue the tradition. But his son was in Seattle now, designing apps for a company Harold could not pronounce. The boy called twice a year, on Christmas and Harold's birthday, and the conversations never lasted more than 10 minutes. Harold did not blame him. The world had changed. Small towns were dying, and young people were right to chase their futures elsewhere. But it still hurt. It hurt in a way that Harold could not name, a hollow ache that lived in his chest alongside the tumor the doctors had found last spring. Richard entered the store with his briefcase and his practiced smile. He had done this 100 times. He knew exactly how to read the desperation in a man's eyes, exactly when to push and when to pretend to retreat. It was a dance, and Richard was very good at dancing. Mr. Brennan, he said, extending his hand. Richard Calloway. We spoke on the phone. Harold shook the hand. Richard's grip was firm but cold, the handshake of a man who touched people without ever really touching them. I remember, Harold said. You want to buy my store. I want to help you, Richard corrected. I understand you've had some medical expenses. I understand the store hasn't been as profitable as it used to be. I'm here to offer you a solution. Harold led him to a small office in the back, past shelves of inventory and a workbench where he had taught 1,000 customers how to fix a leaky faucet or rewire a lamp. The office was cluttered with papers and photographs, memories of a life that Richard could not be bothered to see. They sat across from each other, and Richard laid out his offer. The numbers were stark. The property was worth $400,000 at minimum, but Richard was offering $200,000. He explained it with smooth confidence, citing market conditions, the costs of renovation, the risks his clients were taking. Harold listened in silence. He had been to college decades ago, before his father needed him at the store. He understood what Richard was doing. He understood that this offer was designed to exploit his weakness, to take advantage of a dying man who had no other options. But Harold also understood something that Richard did not. I'll need to think about it, Harold said. Richard's smile flickered. This was not how the script was supposed to go. Desperate people did not ask for time. They grabbed at lifelines with both hands. Of course, Richard said, recovering quickly. Take a few days. But I should mention that my clients are considering other properties. This offer won't be on the table forever. It was a threat disguised as information, and Harold recognized it immediately. I understand, he said. I'll let you know by Friday. Richard left the store with the uncomfortable feeling that something had not gone according to plan. He was not used to this feeling. He did not like it. That evening, Richard ate dinner alone at the only upscale restaurant Cedar Falls had to offer, a farm-to-table establishment that served overpriced steaks to tourists and the occasional visiting businessman. The food was good, but Richard barely tasted it. He was thinking about Harold Brennan, about the way the old man had listened without flinching, about the quiet dignity that had seemed to fill the small office. Richard had crushed dignity before. It was not difficult. You simply had to apply enough pressure, and eventually, everyone broke. But something about Harold nagged at him, some stubborn quality that Richard could not quite identify. He finished his meal, left a minimal tip, and walked back to his hotel. The autumn night was cold, and the stars were bright in a way they never were in Chicago. Richard did not notice them. He was already planning his next move, already calculating how to increase the pressure on Harold Brennan. What Richard did not know was that Harold had made a phone call after he left, and the person Harold called was Samuel Vance. Samuel Vance had known Harold Brennan for almost 40 years. They had gone to high school together, played football on the same team, dated girls who were friends. After graduation, their paths had diverged. Samuel went to the military. Harold went to work at his father's store. But they had never lost touch. Not really. In a small town, you did not lose touch with the people who mattered. When Harold called that night, Samuel was sitting in his garage, cleaning the carburetor of a 1985 Harley-Davidson that he had been restoring for 2 years. The phone buzzed on his workbench, and he wiped his hands on a rag before answering. Sam, Harold said, and Samuel knew immediately that something was wrong. Harold, what's going on? There was a pause, the kind of pause that held weight. Then Harold told him everything. The tumor, the medical bills, the man from Chicago who wanted to buy the store for half its value. Samuel listened without interrupting. When Harold finished, Samuel asked one question. What do you want to do, Harold? Another pause. I don't know, Sam, I really don't. Part of me wants to fight, but I'm tired. I'm so tired. Samuel nodded, even though Harold could not see him. You rest. Let me make some calls. By the next morning, The Iron Guardians knew about Richard Calloway. The club had 47 members spread across 3 counties. They were mechanics and teachers, veterans and nurses, parents and grandparents. They had day jobs and mortgages and children in school. But they also had something that Richard Calloway would never understand. They had each other. Samuel called a meeting at the clubhouse, a converted barn on his property outside of town. The members gathered that evening, sitting on folding chairs and old couches, drinking coffee and listening as Samuel explained the situation. "Harold Brennan is one of us," Samuel said. "Not officially, but in every way that matters. He's sponsored our charity rides for 15 years. He's donated tools and supplies to every project we've ever done. And now some city vulture wants to take his store for pennies while he's fighting for his life." The room was silent. Then a woman named Rosa, a nurse practitioner who had been with the club for 12 years, spoke up. "What do we know about this guy?" Samuel pulled out a folder. "Richard Calloway, works for a real estate investment firm in Chicago, specializes in distressed properties. He finds people who are struggling, offers them lowball deals, and flips the properties for profit. He's done this a dozen times in the last 3 years." A young man named Derek, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm in Waterloo, leaned forward. "Is what he's doing illegal?" "Probably not," Samuel admitted. "But legal doesn't mean right." The discussion continued for 2 hours. Ideas were proposed and debated. Some wanted to confront Richard directly. Others suggested finding legal ways to protect Harold. A few thought they should simply raise enough money to pay Harold's medical bills. In the end, they decided to do all of it. The next morning, Richard Calloway woke to find his Mercedes surrounded. Not threatened, not vandalized, just surrounded. 12 motorcycles were parked in a perfect circle around his car in the hotel parking lot, chrome gleaming in the early light. Their owners were nowhere to be seen. Richard stood at his hotel window, coffee in hand, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself the bikers were just passing through and had happened to park near his car. But he did not believe it. He waited 2 hours before going outside, hoping the motorcycles would be gone. They were not. Richard walked to his car with forced casualness, as if the metal circle around him meant nothing. He unlocked the door, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. As he backed out carefully, trying not to scratch his paint on any of the bikes, he noticed a small card tucked under his windshield wiper. He stopped the car, got out, and grabbed the card. It was a simple business card for the Iron Guardians Motorcycle Club. On the back, someone had written 3 words in neat handwriting. "We see you." Richard's hand trembled, just slightly, as he read those words. Then he crushed the card in his fist, threw it on the ground, and drove away. But he could not shake the feeling that something had shifted. The predator in him, the instinct that had always told him when to strike and when to retreat, was sending a signal he did not want to hear. He ignored it. Ignoring inconvenient signals was what Richard did best. If you have ever felt unseen, overlooked, or dismissed, pause right now and leave a comment saying, "I believe in everyday heroes." Let us know that you are here, that you are part of this community that sees the courage in ordinary people. Your words matter more than you know. 2 days passed. Richard continued his campaign against Harold, showing up at the store with new documents, new arguments, new subtle threats. He mentioned the name of Harold's mortgage company. He implied that he knew about unpaid invoices from suppliers. He painted a picture of inevitable decline, a future in which Harold would lose everything anyway, so why not take the money now? Harold listened. He nodded. He said he was still thinking. What Richard did not know was that Harold was buying time. The Iron Guardians were working. Derek, the paralegal, had enlisted the help of a lawyer friend in Des Moines. Together they were researching Richard's past deals, looking for patterns, looking for anything that crossed the line from aggressive to illegal. Rosa was coordinating with Harold's doctors, helping him navigate the insurance system, finding programs and grants that could help with his medical bills. and Samuel was doing what Samuel did best. He was talking to people. He talked to the other business owners on Main Street. He talked to the mayor. He talked to the editor of the local newspaper. He talked to everyone who had ever bought a hammer or a box of nails from Brennan Hardware, reminding them of what the store meant to this community. The response was overwhelming. By Friday morning, when Richard arrived at Harold's store for what he expected to be the final negotiation, he found something unexpected. The street was full of people. They stood on the sidewalks, in the street, in front of the hardware store. They held signs that said, "We stand with Harold," and "Not for sale," and "Cedar Falls fights back." There were young parents with children in strollers. There were elderly couples who had been shopping at Brennan Hardware since the store opened. There were teenagers who had gotten their first jobs here, sweeping floors and stocking shelves. And standing at the front of the crowd, arms crossed, were the Iron Guardians. Richard stopped his car in the middle of the street. He could not believe what he was seeing. This was not how it was supposed to work. People like Harold Brennan were supposed to be alone. They were supposed to be isolated by their problems, easy to pick off like wounded animals. But Harold was not alone. Harold had never been alone. Richard got out of his car and walked toward the store. The crowd parted to let him through, but no one spoke. They simply watched him with eyes that held neither anger nor fear, only resolve. He reached the front door and found Samuel Vance blocking his path. "Mr. Calloway," Samuel said calmly. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Richard's face was red. "What is this? What do you think you're doing?" "We're supporting our friend," Samuel said. "That's all. No threats, no intimidation, just community." "This is harassment," Richard spat. "I'll call the police." "Please do," Samuel said. "The chief is right over there. He's been shopping here for 30 years. His daughter got her first bicycle from this store." Richard looked where Samuel was pointing and saw a man in a police uniform holding a sign that said, "Harold's Store, Harold's Choice." For the first time in his adult life, Richard Calloway did not know what to say. The crowd did not chant or cheer. They did not need to. Their presence was enough. They were a wall of human connection, a reminder that some things in this world could not be bought or sold or calculated. Richard turned and walked back to his car. He did not look at anyone. He did not speak. He simply got behind the wheel and drove away. But he did not go back to Chicago. Not yet. Because Richard Calloway was not the kind of man who admitted defeat easily. He was the kind of man who looked for weaknesses, who found pressure points, who never stopped pushing until he got what he wanted. And he had just found a new target. That night, Richard made a phone call. He called the regional manager of the bank that held the mortgage on Harold's store. He had done business with this bank before. He knew people. He knew how to make things happen. "I need you to call in the loan," Richard said. "Harold Brennan's mortgage. He's behind on payments. Trigger the default clause." There was hesitation on the other end of the line. "That's a significant step, Mr. Calloway. The Brennan family has been a customer for decades. And I'm a customer who brings you millions of dollars in business every year. Which relationship do you value more?" The threat was implicit but clear. The regional manager promised to look into it. Richard hung up with a smile. This was how the real world worked. Not with crowds and signs and feelings, but with leverage, with power, with the cold, hard reality that money always won. But Richard had made a mistake. He had made his call from the hotel bar, where he had been drinking whiskey to calm his nerves after the confrontation at the store. He had spoken loudly, confident that no one in this backwater town would understand what he was doing. But sitting 2 stools away, nursing a beer and pretending to watch the football game on the television, was a young man named Marcus. Marcus was Derek's younger brother. He was also a member of the Iron Guardians, and he had heard everything. 30 minutes later, Marcus was at Samuel's house, explaining what he had overheard. Samuel listened with a face carved from stone. When Marcus finished, Samuel picked up his phone and called Derek. "We need that lawyer friend of yours," Samuel said. Tonight. What followed was a flurry of activity that would have impressed a military command center. Derek and his lawyer friend reviewed every document related to Harold's mortgage. They found what they were looking for at 2 in the morning. The bank could not call in the loan. Harold was not in default. His payments were current, every single one of them. Richard had lied about the missed payments, hoping the bank would not bother to check. More importantly, the lawyer found something else. In Richard's previous deals, there was a pattern. He had used false information to pressure banks and creditors before. He had made representations that were not true. He had, on at least 2 occasions, crossed the line from aggressive negotiation into fraud. By dawn, Derek had compiled a file that was 6 inches thick. And by 9 in the morning, that file was on the desk of the State Attorney General's office. Richard Calloway was eating breakfast at the hotel restaurant when his phone rang. It was his firm's legal counsel in Chicago. "Richard, we have a problem. A big problem. There's an investigation. You need to come back immediately." Richard's fork clattered against his plate. "An investigation? Into what?" "Into you. Into your deals. The Attorney General's office in Iowa has been in contact with the FBI. They're looking at wire fraud charges." The blood drained from Richard's face. He stood up abruptly, knocking over his coffee. He did not notice the stains spreading across the white tablecloth. He did not notice the other diners staring at him. He only knew that his world was crumbling. Richard threw money on the table and ran to his room. He packed his bags in 5 minutes and was on the road to Chicago within 10. He drove faster than he had ever driven, his mind racing with excuses and explanations and escape routes. But there would be no escape. The Iron Guardians had not threatened him. They had not broken any laws. They had simply shone a light into the dark corners where Richard had been operating for years. And in that light, his sins were visible for everyone to see. 3 months later, the trial began. Richard Calloway sat at the defendant's table in a federal courthouse in Des Moines, wearing a suit that no longer fit quite right. He had lost weight since his arrest. He had lost clients. He had lost his partnership at the firm. He had lost everything he had spent his life building. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Former clients testified about the pressure tactics he had used. Bank officials admitted they had looked the other way because Richard brought them business. Documents proved that he had lied, manipulated, and defrauded his way to fortune. The prosecutor's final witness was Harold Brennan. Harold walked to the stand slowly, his illness evident in every step. But his eyes were still sharp, and his voice was still strong. He told the story of Richard's visit to his store. He explained the lowball offer, the subtle threats, the exploitation of his medical condition. He spoke not with anger, but with sadness, the sadness of a man who could not understand how anyone could treat another human being that way. When Harold finished his testimony, he looked directly at Richard. "I feel sorry for you," Harold said. "I really do. You spent your whole life taking from people, and now you've got nothing. I spent my whole life giving to my community, and even now, at the end, I've got more than I could ever need. Not money, something better. I've got people who love me." Richard could not hold Harold's gaze. He looked down at the table, at his hands, at the empty space where his wedding ring used to be before his wife filed for divorce. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. Richard Calloway was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. After the verdict was announced, the Iron Guardians gathered outside the courthouse. They did not celebrate. That was not their way. They simply stood together in the autumn sunshine, a group of men and women in leather vests, watching as justice was done. Samuel Vance spoke quietly to the reporters who had gathered. "We didn't do this for revenge," he said. "We did this because Harold Brennan is our friend. We did this because our community deserves to be protected from people who see us as nothing but opportunities to exploit. We did this because it was right." A reporter asked about the motorcycle club's role in the investigation. Samuel smiled, just slightly. We're just people who ride motorcycles. We look out for each other. We look out for our neighbors. That's all we've ever done. 6 months after the trial, Harold Brennan passed away. He died at home, surrounded by the people who loved him. His son had flown in from Seattle and had been by his side for the last 3 weeks. The boy, who was not really a boy anymore but a man in his 30s, had finally understood what he had been running away from. The day after Harold died, his son made an announcement. He was moving back to Cedar Falls. He was going to keep the store open. He was going to learn the trade, just as his father had learned from his grandfather. The Iron Guardians were at the funeral, every single one of them. They stood in a long line as Harold's casket was carried to the grave, their engines silent, their heads bowed. When the service was over, Samuel approached Harold's son. "Your father was a good man," Samuel said. "One of the best I've ever known." Harold's son nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you for everything you did for him, for everything you did for this town." Samuel shook his hand. "That's what we do. We take care of our own." 1 year later, the annual Cedar Falls charity ride drew more participants than ever before. Over 200 motorcycles rolled through the streets, raising money for the local children's hospital. At the front of the procession was Harold's son, riding a Harley-Davidson that had once belonged to his father, and beside him, silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, was Samuel Vance. The ride ended at Brennan Hardware Store, where tables had been set up with food and drinks. The whole town seemed to be there, gathered in the parking lot and spilling onto the sidewalk. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, approached Samuel with a piece of paper. "I drew this for you," she said shyly. Samuel knelt down to accept the drawing. It showed a group of motorcycles riding through a rainbow with the words, "Thank you, heroes," written in crayon at the top. Samuel looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at the little girl. "Thank you," he said. "I'm going to keep this forever." The girl smiled and ran back to her parents. Samuel stood up, still holding the drawing, and looked at the crowd around him. These were his people. This was his home. This was what mattered. Not money, not power, not the things that Richard Callaway had spent his life chasing. Just people, just community, just love. Sometimes the world teaches us lessons in unexpected ways. Sometimes the people we dismiss, the ones we look down on, the ones we think are beneath us, turn out to be the very ones who save us from ourselves. Richard Callaway had looked at the Iron Guardians and seen nothing. He had seen costumes and pretense and failure. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he could not see the truth standing right in front of him. The truth was simple. The bikers were not playing pretend. They were living the values that Richard had forgotten existed. Loyalty, honor, compassion, the willingness to stand up for what was right, even when it was difficult. These were not the values of weakness. These were the values of strength, the strength that came from knowing who you were and what you stood for. Richard would have 7 years in prison to think about this. 7 years to consider the choices he had made and the man he had become. Maybe, somewhere in that time, he would find his own redemption. Or maybe not. Some people never learn. Some people spend their whole lives taking without ever understanding what they are missing. But for the people of Cedar Falls, and for the Iron Guardians who protected them, the lesson was already clear. Family is not just blood. It is choice. It is the people who show up when you need them, who stand beside you when the world turns against you, who remind you that you are not alone. Harold Brennan had known this. He had lived it every day of his life, in the small kindnesses he showed to his customers, in the quiet generosity he extended to his community. And now his legacy lived on, in his son who had come home, in the store that still stood on the corner of Main Street, in the annual ride that raised money for children who needed help. This is how change happens, not with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but with small acts of courage repeated over time. with people who choose to see each other, to care for each other, to stand together against the forces that would tear them apart. The businessman came to Cedar Falls expecting to find weakness. He came expecting to exploit and profit and leave without looking back. Instead, he found something he had never encountered before. He found a community that refused to be broken. He found a brotherhood that defined strength not by how much you could take, but by how much you were willing to give. He found the truth that money cannot buy, that power cannot compel, that arrogance cannot comprehend. He found family, and in the end, that family was his undoing. But it was also the salvation of Harold Brennan. It was the salvation of Cedar Falls. It was a reminder to everyone who heard this story that goodness still exists in this world, if only we have the eyes to see it. The motorcycles still ride through Cedar Falls every autumn. The store still stands on the corner. The children still grow up knowing that their community will protect them. And somewhere, in a prison cell far from home, Richard Calloway sits alone with his thoughts, wondering how everything went so wrong. The answer is simple. He mocked the wrong people. He underestimated the power of community. He forgot that sometimes the ones who look like outlaws are the truest heroes of all. If you watched this far, it is because you connected with this story. It is because you understand that the world needs more people like the Iron Guardians, more communities like Cedar Falls, more moments where ordinary people stand up and say enough. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really likes the stories on this channel. Your presence here matters. Your engagement tells me that these stories of courage and redemption are reaching the hearts they were meant to reach. And if this story moved you, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who might be feeling alone, who might be facing their own Richard Calloway, who might need to be reminded that they are not without allies. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already. Every week we bring you new stories of everyday heroes, of communities that come together, of the light that shines even in the darkest moments. Because that is what we do here. We tell stories that matter. We remind you that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. We show you that brotherhood is not just a word, but a way of living. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. Until next time, remember, the measure of a life is not what you take, but what you give. It is not the size of your bank account, but the depth of your connections. It is not the power you hold over others, but the love you share with them. Honor does not retire. Brotherhood never ends. And sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we least expect. Ride safe. Live with purpose, and never, ever underestimate the strength of people who stand together. The autumn leaves still fall in Cedar Falls. The chrome still gleams in the Iowa sunshine. The store on the corner still opens every morning, run by a son who finally came home. And the Iron Guardians still ride. They will always ride. Because that is who they are. That is who we all can be if we choose. Harold's drawing still hangs on Samuel's wall, the one the little girl gave him, with the motorcycles riding through the rainbow. He looks at it every morning when he wakes up, and every night before he goes to sleep. It reminds him why he does what he does. It reminds him that the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact. It reminds him that in a world full of Richard Callaways, there will always be Iron Guardians to stand against them. And that is a truth worth holding on to. That is a truth worth sharing. That is the truth at the heart of every story we tell. The businessman mocked a biker gang. He thought he was superior. He thought his money and his power made him invincible. But they surprised him. They surprised everyone, because they were not what they appeared to be. They were something much, much more. They were family. And family always wins. The end. But not really. Because stories like this do not end. They ripple outward, touching lives we will never know about, inspiring acts of courage we will never witness, building a world that is a little bit kinder than it was before. That is the power of storytelling. That is why we do this. And that is why we will keep doing it. One story at a time, one heart at a time, until the whole world remembers what it means to stand together. Cedar Falls remembers. The Iron Guardians remember. And now, so do you. Carry this story with you. Let it remind you, in your darkest moments, that you are never truly alone. Let it inspire you, when you see injustice, to stand up and speak out. Let it show you, when you encounter someone different from yourself, that appearances can be deceiving. The man in the leather vest might be a hero. The child at the bus stop might need a protector. The stranger in the diner might become your closest friend. You never know. You can never know. But you can choose to see. You can choose to care. You can choose to be part of something bigger than yourself. That is the invitation at the heart of this story. That is the invitation we extend to you. Join us. Be part of this community. Help us spread these stories of courage and compassion. Because the world needs them now more than ever. The world needs you now more than ever. And together, we can make a difference. One story at a time. One act of kindness at a time. One moment of courage at a time. That is how change happens. That is how heroes are made. That is how we build the world we want to live in. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for sharing. This story is now yours. Do with it what you will. But please do something, because the Richard Callaways of the world never stop. And neither should we. The Iron Guardians ride on, and so do we. Together. Always. Forever. Amen. Harold Brennan looked down from somewhere beyond the clouds, if such a place existed, and smiled. His son was behind the counter of the store, helping a customer choose the right drill bit for a home project. The sun was shining through the windows, casting golden light across the hardwood floors. It was a good day. They were all good days now, because the store was more than a business. It was a legacy. It was a testament to what happened when ordinary people chose to stand together against those who would do them harm. Richard Callaway had come to Cedar Falls with a simple plan: exploit a dying man, take his property, and move on to the next victim. He had done it before. He had always gotten away with it. But not this time. This time, he had encountered something he did not understand. Something that could not be quantified or calculated or controlled. He had encountered love. The love of a community for one of its own. The love of brothers and sisters who rode together through good times and bad. The love that shows up when everything seems lost, that stands firm when the world says surrender. That love had undone him, and that love had saved Harold. The tumor took Harold's body, but it could not take his spirit. That spirit lived on in his son, in the store, in the annual charity ride, in the drawings that children made for the bikers who had become their heroes. Love always finds a way. That is the lesson of Cedar Falls. That is the lesson of the Iron Guardians. That is the lesson we hope you carry with you long after this story ends. The screen will go dark. The video will end. You will return to your life with all its challenges and complications and struggles. But somewhere, in the back of your mind, this story will remain. And maybe, just maybe, it will change something. Maybe it will inspire you to check on an elderly neighbor. Maybe it will encourage you to donate to a local charity. Maybe it will remind you to call your parents, your siblings, your old friends. Maybe it will give you the courage to stand up against injustice when you see it. Or maybe it will simply make you smile. Any of those would be enough. All of those would be wonderful, because that is what stories are for. They remind us who we are. They show us who we could be. They connect us to something larger than ourselves. And in a world that often feels fragmented and isolated, that connection is precious. It is worth fighting for. It is worth protecting. It is worth sharing. So share this story. Share it with love. Share it with hope. Share it with the knowledge that you are part of something beautiful. You are part of this community. You are part of this family. You are part of the change we are making, one story at a time. And we are grateful for you. More grateful than words can express. The motorcycles are parked in Samuel's garage now. The autumn sun has set. The first stars are appearing in the Iowa sky. Tomorrow, there will be new challenges, new injustices to confront, new people to help. But tonight, there is peace. Tonight, there is gratitude. Tonight, there is the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what they did mattered. That is enough. That is always enough. Good night, Harold. Sleep well. Your store is in good hands. Your legacy is secure. And your friends will never forget you. Neither will we. Rest now. You have earned it. And when the spring comes and the charity ride begins again, your spirit will be there, riding at the front, where you always belonged, among friends, among family, among the heroes who surprised us all. The businessman mocked a biker gang, and they surprised him. But the biggest surprise was not his downfall. The biggest surprise was the love that made it all possible, the love that always surprises us, the love that never fails, the end, for real this time. But the story goes on, in Cedar Falls, in communities everywhere, in hearts that choose courage over fear, in people who refuse to look away. The story always goes on, and so do we, together, always, forever. Thank you.